All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear and see us. We are using a new platform here at the Baker Institute, so hopefully we won't run into technical difficulties. But anyway, I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to the Baker Institute for Public Policy Center for Energy Studies new webinar series that is devoted to waste recycling, sustainability, and circular economy. So we are embarking on a really stimulating sequence of virtual events that's going to bring together thought leaders and experts and other interested parties along the value chain to create a platform that helps elevate the discussion and builds awareness around these issues and those issues that are relevant to energy and the environment. And with local, regional, and national materials management policies and practices being key components in achieving climate targets and sustainability goals and circularity, there's really immense value in exploring these topics from a variety of perspectives. And so that's what we're going to be addressing throughout the series. And so if you have questions, please submit those to the Q&A section of this webinar, and we'll try to answer them throughout our discussion. And if we can't get to all of the inquiries, I can capture them and be sure to address them in future webinars. But as we're commencing this webinar series, I thought it would be relevant to commence the series with David Biderman. He is the CEO and Executive Director of SWANA, and that's the Solid Waste Association of North America. They are the largest member-based solid waste association in the world. They have, I believe, 47 chapters in the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean, and they have, I think, over 11,000 members that represent both the public and private sector. And so it is my pleasure to welcome David Biderman. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be here.
Well, so look, and so the waste management for in our circle at the Baker Institute, and for those of you that may be joining us on this webinar, it may be a new topic for you. So we're going to kind of start from the ground up here. And solid waste management, it is a universal issue. Globally, we generate over 2 billion tons of municipal solid waste annually. And very conservatively, 33% of that is mismanaged. And our global waste generation is expected to grow to over 3 billion tons by 2050. And annually, or I should say daily, I think the average American produces more than 4 pounds of trash a day. And that's more than double the amount we produced in 1960. So it's it's a big issue, and it's something that we need to pay attention to, because these figures are staggering, and they emphasize the criticality of the waste management sector and the need for sustainable integrated systems. And so David, as the leading association in the solid waste field, can you give us an overview of the current United States solid waste management system and the industry?
Sure, Rachel, and I just want to thank you and Rice University and the Baker Institute here at the outset for allowing me to have the opportunity to speak both to you as well as the participants in today's webinar. The U.S. solid waste system is really simple for individual homeowners or people who participate in it. Right? They roll their cart to the street, and a truck comes along and takes the contents and throws it in the back, and they come home usually and the cart is empty, and to them the garbage just magically disappears. But what is involved in that happening every day in 160 million households and millions of businesses is a very complicated system, because first of all, just the sheer volume. You mentioned that we generate more than 4 pounds per person per day, so that adds up to something like 270 million tons of municipal solid waste every year that the waste sector needs to manage properly. And unlike Europe, for example, we don't have a national law that governs how the waste is managed. There is a federal law known as RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, passed 45 years ago, 45 years ago. And that governs disposal facilities. So that established that landfills have to be up to snuff, what the requirements are for the landfills, but it delegates authority over how it's collected and how it's processed, and in fact, some of the disposal decisions to the states and local governments. And we have 50 states in the United States and 10,000 or more communities. And so as a result, the way waste is managed differs very much by geography, from state to state, and within a state, from place to place. And so that complicates the system because there's a patchwork out there. It's not you have to recycle certain materials nationwide, or the truck is the same nationwide. It's very much different depending on geography.
Which makes it, difficult for compliance and enforcement when there's those inconsistencies. Especially as a consumer and as a hazardous waste generator, if we're talking about hazardous solid waste. And just for clarification, for those of you, we talk about solid waste, and that can be a bit misleading, right? Because the legal definition of solid waste, it really has nothing to do with its physical state. Rather, it deals with whether or not the material, is a waste. And RCRA, our major federal legislation that governs waste, it actually defines solid waste as any, and I won't read the whole thing, but it's any garbage or refuse, and that could be a solid, it could be liquid, semi-solid, or contained gaseous material that's generated from industry or commercial activities, mining and agriculture. And so that's when I first got into the waste industry and started getting deep into the regulations, that was one of the first things that solid waste. Well, why are we just regulating solid waste? But that is an important factor there.
That's absolutely right. And the definitions matter. I think for purposes of our conversation today, we should be thinking about municipal solid waste, or as we refer to it often, MSW. And the reason for that is because that's what EPA tracks in terms of how much is generated, in terms of whether it's disposed of, recycled, composted, burned for energy. And so as a result, there's year-over-year data there that I could discuss that allows us to see where the trends are and where some of the opportunities are.
And so when we talk about MSW, we're talking about commercial waste, household, and institutional waste. And that really does not include industrial waste or hazardous or construction waste.
Well, yeah, anything that ends up in a landfill or a waste to energy facility is considered municipal solid waste. And within that category, we also include commingled recyclables, so metal, glass, plastic, paper. Almost left that one out, and it's the most important one. And composting, so yard waste and food waste, right, which is a growing area of opportunity that we're seeing some progress on.
And David, could you give us just a quick history? How did we get to where we are? And what's our situation with landfills? How many landfills do we have in the United States?
Sure. So before you and I were born, every town had their own municipal dump, and people threw their garbage in the dump. And as a result of this federal statute that we discussed, RCRA, and the EPA regulations that were issued in response to RCRA, known as Subtitle D, landfills, municipal solid waste landfills, or should I say dump sites, closed and were replaced by sanitary landfills. These are modern landfills that comply with the air emissions and water emissions and other requirements that are stated in Subtitle D. So we went from having more than 10,000 dump sites in the United States to now where we have somewhere around 1,500 landfills. Now, the difference is that these landfills are much larger than the dump sites were that existed 30 or 35 years ago. And the reason for that is because these landfills take material from a much broader geography. So when in the Northeast United States, when Philadelphia, New York City, and others closed their dump sites, they began to ship larger quantities of waste to sanitary landfills that are situated in other states. And those landfills are larger, often in rural locations, where they can accept larger quantities. And so you have landfills now that receive up to 10,000 tons of garbage per day and safely manage it in compliance with RCRA Subtitle D regulations.
So look, so there's been a lot of changes and challenges posed by COVID. The pandemic, as you and your members are well aware, it really highlighted some of the shortcomings and bottlenecks that exist in the waste and the recycling economy. It tested our preparedness and it revealed this overall lack of resilience in some areas. and exposed a shortfall in domestic production of critical goods. And it kind of highlighted and accentuated our dependence on foreign markets, and especially in the disposal and end-of-life management of waste and recycled. And so when we look at the United States, and I guess over the first several months when the pandemic was working its way through the U.S., I think there were, and this figure may not be the most up-to-date one, but I think that I was calculating there are over 146 recycling programs that were suspended. And that was due to a number of reasons, right? It was health and processing or end market issues related to COVID. And this impacted both the curbside and the drop off. And so that represented over 87,000 tons that were disrupted in less than 3 months across 35 states. And you know, in Europe, I think there were some companies that were facing bankruptcy. But what are some of the major trends that you're all seeing in the waste industry since the pandemic, and how is the industry adjusting?
So we could speak for hours about that, and it's been one of the most, no, I'm not going to say one of the most, it's been the most dramatic, quick change that I've seen in my 20 plus years in the waste sector. And what we've seen are three primary things have happened. As so many more Americans were at home as opposed to going to work or school, we saw a very significant increase in the amount of waste generated from what we call the residential sector. So all of us living at home, I'm doing this webinar from my home in Virginia, we all generate a lot more waste from home than we did when most Americans are working. So we saw by early April, a 20 to 25% increase in the residential volume that was being generated in the residential side of the industry. Now, this was because people were at home. It was because people were doing spring cleaning. It was because some people did what some people refer to as panic buying, using e-commerce. And on recycling day in my neighborhood, every single house had piles of cardboard next to the garbage can or the recycling container, because you saw that people were just buying and buying and buying. So that peaked at 20 to 25% above baseline. And since April, we've seen that decline closer to where it was before COVID. We're still in the 5 to 9% above benchmark or baseline on residential. But what has happened as a result of that pressure on the residential collection system was that local governments had to make some difficult choices about how to pick up all of that excess trash that all of a sudden they were responsible for picking up. And so some communities were forced to suspend some of their other collection services to make sure the garbage gets picked up. And so we did see about 100 communities suspend curbside recycling. We saw some number, less than 100 of communities suspend bulky waste pickup. So the pickup mattresses or other, items like that. The majority of those suspended services have been reinstated now as the system has normalized. So that is what happened on the residential side. At the same time that happened on the residential side, we saw a dramatic decrease in the amount of waste material and recyclables generated from commercial establishments. So the offices and the schools and the entertainment center, think about New York City. Broadway shut down, all the hotels shut down, no tourists come in. So the amount of commercial waste generated in Manhattan was down more than 80% at the bottom. And nationwide, it was down 15 to 20%. And over the last few months, as we've begun to normalize, as some states have opened up and gone back to work, we're seeing closer to, but not quite yet at baseline. So we're down maybe 5-6% in terms of the commercial side, while we're up somewhere between 5 and 8% on the residential side.
And so there was already a multitude of existing complications that came to head and created this perfect storm to compound the waste and recycling issues already, even prior to the pandemic. And China's national sword policy was one of them. And that's what, the national sword policy is something that placed restrictions on imports of recyclables and some other waste. And so it really highlighted just how globalization can impact our businesses and supply chains. And I won't get into too much detail about this because this is something I could talk about for a long time. But we started seeing the signs of that back in 2013. If we look at the history of that, but so that's brought some existing pressures too, and that included with some labor shortages and long time reliance on foreign processing and end markets and turbulent commodity markets with the shale gas boom and lower cost of oil that made it that really disincentivized the production of recycled materials because virgin was so much cheaper to produce. So there's cheap landfill rates, high levels of contamination. I mean, there's a whole slew of things, right, that fed into this, and then really inadequate funding in a lot of areas for public works and sanitation. And so I think the pandemic was just another reminder of just how intertwined our supply chains are. And so, with all of that and looking at the things that the industry has faced over the years, how can we reimagine the post-pandemic future and build resiliency into our operations from all of these disruptions, whether it's disaster response or storm events or now pandemic?
So there's a lot to unpack there. We became dependent on foreign markets, particularly China. And China has since 2013, when they started what was called the Green Fence, and then in 2017, when they announced National Sword, which is another program to restrict imports of scrap and recyclables, and not just from the United States, but from all over the world, which, the fact that we got into a trade war with China didn't help us. But so the export market has been in decline for the last 5 years. And so what we need in the United States to make our recycling system healthier and more robust are a number of things. Number one, we need more domestic capacity. We need more facilities that are able to purchase and use recovered paper, recovered plastic, and recovered metal from municipal recycling programs. Fortunately, in the wake of National Sword, we've seen 20 new facilities be proposed just for paper, just for fiber, which is the term of art used in the industry to describe different grades of paper, mixed paper and cardboard and things like that. And some of those facilities have started to open. Pratt Recycling opened up a facility in Ohio in late 2019. And I had the good fortune to be in Ohio like the week before the facility was opening, and they were so giddy. They were so excited about this, and there are other facilities that are in the process of moving forward with construction, and that will help to alleviate some of the pressure because as a result of China exiting the market to some extent and other countries in Asia particularly not willing to become recipient of so much of our exported material, we saw a significant decline in the value of recovered material. So the material that gets sent out of a MRF, out of a material recovery facility, if it was worth $90 a ton in 2017, it was worth $30, $35 a ton in late 2019. Yeah. It was less than half. But the processing cost at the MRF has increased as companies and city agencies try to pull out the contamination. They had to raise wages to attract people to work there because remember, we had an unemployment rate of only 3.5% earlier this year. And so what happened as a result of COVID is fascinating. When the commercial sector of the United States shut down to a large degree, that's a major source of paper that's used to make fiber products that are used by Amazon and a whole host of others to send things to people's houses. The toilet paper shortage of March and April is in some ways tied to the changing supply chain as a result of recycled content. We saw a spike in the value of paper because there was so little commercial paper available. And now, as things are normalizing, and I'm avoiding the phrase new normal because I don't like that phrase, but as things are normalizing, we're seeing prices settle down a little bit to well above where they were in 2019, which is good because that means companies and agencies are going to be willing to make investments in capital and labor to improve their facilities so that we can have a more robust recycling system.
And so we have a question from the audience about recycling. And the question is, how much are we recycling compared to, say, 50 years ago or 25 years ago or even 10 years ago?
That's a terrific question. So the official data set on that is the EPA Facts and Figures, which is an annual document produced by EPA. And it charts, starting from 1960, what the waste generation and waste recycling rates are. In 1985, right before curbside recycling took off in the United States, the recycling rate in the United States was about 10%. And then over the next 15 years, we saw a dramatic increase up to about 28.5% by the year 2000. And then over the last 17 years, that rate of increase has moderated very significantly as it's more difficult to increase recycling, year over year. And so right now we're at about a 35% recycled rate. So 35% of 270 million tons. So you're talking about 95 million tons. And of those tons, a chunk of that is yard waste, not what we think of as recycling, not the metals and the paper and the glass and the plastic. So there are challenges that many local governments face, particularly on each coast. The coasts and the states and cities have these audacious, aggressive recycling goals, 50% by 2030, right, or zero waste by 2030. We continue to support those efforts. SWANA believes that waste is a resource and we should extract as much value as possible from that material. We always think there's going to be a room in the system to have a landfill, but we shouldn't be throwing cardboard away. We shouldn't be throwing food waste away. Food waste is filled with energy, and it should be repurposed as food, first of all, and then used for other uses, energy-related uses, before we end up putting it in a landfill.
Right, and so it's more about, it's not so much about waste management, but resource management. And that's kind of the whole framework and foundation around circular economy and all of that. And there's another question from the audience that I want to ask and get your opinion on. And how about reshoring of industries? Will that, do you think, exacerbate the waste management and recycling concerns? So I know that what we've learned from the pandemic and what we've seen is that, and I guess you could say there are opportunities that have emerged as shortening and building redundancies in our supply chains, and even reshoring some of our operations here. And one could argue that that reshoring our operations could be a good thing, but it may it may make us less likely to compete. But so what are your thoughts about that and reshoring here and its effect on waste management and recycling systems?
So I think that nets out positively for the system, because many of the companies that are coming back to the United States, for lack of a better phrase, or reshoring, have made commitments to use recycled content. And so that will actually create more markets for the paper, the plastic, and the metal that we generate at the recycling facilities. I think one of the problems we had, and one of the reasons we became dependent on China, for example, was because many industries in the United States stopped competing with the overseas and moved manufacturing offshore. And so it became much easier, particularly on the West Coast, to simply put all of that recycling into a container ship in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. And that ship was going back to China anyway, because it was going to pick up the next load of stuff coming to Walmart, Target, etc. And they became voracious purchasers of our scrap and recyclables. So to the extent that U.S. companies are reshoring here in the United States, I think that's net positive for our recycling system. Okay,
and so if we could just for a moment, since you mentioned, we've been talking a bit about exports. What is so shipment of waste across jurisdictional boundaries for the purpose of treatment, recycling, recovery, or disposal. It's become very prevalent in North America, not just North America, but in a lot of developed countries. And it's a very polarizing topic, and it's generated a lot of attention at the national and international levels. And the recycling industry, they depend both on the domestic manufacturing to access global markets, and so the export is really important for this whole picture. But there is a lot of institutionalized stigma against exporting of secondhand goods and other commodities to developed economies. How does export fit into SWANA's member companies' business models? How do we I guess I'll first let you answer that, because I guess my larger question to this, there's so many different facets on this, and even on our prior conversation before we got on here, I mean, this is something I'm really interested in. But I mean, how do we ensure that there's this even playing field in terms of the environmental, the labor standards, the social standards, when we are talking about a circular carbon economy, circular economy. So first off, I guess, how does export fit into the business models when we talk about?
Sure. So the percentage of material that's being exported has been declining, year over year, and I would divide paper and plastic as recovered paper separately from recovered plastic, because there still is a reasonably robust market for some of the paper. India has replaced China as the leading importer of paper material, fiber material from the United States, but it's nowhere near as large as what China used to get. On the plastic side, China has essentially eliminated imports of mixed plastic, of mixed post-consumer plastic. And in 2018 to 2019, you saw this bubble of plastic go to Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and other countries that were very poorly prepared for that material. And one of my favorite stories I love to tell is when I was speaking in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia at a conference, I was actually summoned to the US Embassy by the ambassador, so I could explain to her and her staff why the port in Malaysia was getting inundated with containers of plastic from America. And it was because of national sword in China. So each one of those countries has now started to impose restrictions on imports. We need to create better domestic markets here in the United States. That's not to say that we should never export any scrap or waste material, because there may be a buyer willing to pay more for it. But there should be some standards that apply to the movement of that material. And if I may, there are two things that will occur when the calendar year turns from 2020 to 2021 that are going to limit the ability of the United States or any other developed country to continue to export material. The Basel Convention has been recently amended, and that amendment takes effect on January 1st, 2021. As a result of that, it will become much more difficult for any country to export plastic without getting consent from the importing country. The paperwork alone on that will make it very difficult. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that earlier this summer, China announced that it was going to implement the final stage of national sword in 2021, which means that while the plastic market had gone away, they were still taking significant quantities of fiber, and in particular, old corrugated cardboard, old corrugated containers, also known as cardboard. They say that they're no longer going to accept that material starting next year. And so we're going to need to find a home for the cardboard and other material that goes to China, and we need to find it pretty quickly.
And so, so I guess back to, there is a fair amount of exporting, and a lot of it is needed and legitimate for our global economies. How do we push back against some of those artificial barriers to the free and fair trade of waste and scrap commodities and products, such as used electronics? And how do we reconcile that with some of the unquantified, social and environmental and economic impacts a lot in emerging economies? I mean, because we talk about circular economy, it's really looking at the entire system. But at the same time, a circular economy doesn't work well if materials are just circulating around in one country or one continent. So what are your thoughts on that? And what are the member companies doing to look at some of those issues?
So you're absolutely right that the notion of a global circular economy is undercut by restrictions on transboundary movement. of material. And at the same time, though, some of the material that has been sent to developing countries in particular is either not being processed properly and ends up, in a field or worse. And some of that material that's sent to these countries unfortunately, is garbage and is not actually recyclable. And what we've seen, and this relates to, these more global environmental issues relating to waste, is that material gets washed into creeks and rivers and ends up in the ocean. And we've seen a tremendous increase in the amount and volume of waste material in oceans, in particular plastic. Jenna Jembeck, who's a SWANA member at the University of Georgia, has done a couple of studies, and the one that has public attention is that by 2050, there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish in terms of weight. If that isn't something that gets people's attention, I'm not sure what will. Perhaps the pictures of beautiful beaches littered by plastic in many colors will. But we need to both reduce marine litter at the source and help and do technology transfer to lesser developed countries, to allow them to have the same kind of developed world system that we have here in the United States. Because I've been to a number of developing countries in recent years, and whether it's Brazil or others, they are exactly where the United States was in 1975. Lots of dump sites, low recycling rates, and we transitioned over the course of about 20 years to the system that we have today. We need to help foreign governments, state governments, provincial governments, and local governments throughout the world make that transition, but I don't want us to take 20 years to do it, because as you and the World Bank have noted, the volume of garbage production is going up exponentially, and we can't wait until 2050 to have a system that works globally.
Yeah, and I think the other point to note on this is the fact that we are in different stages of recycling and waste management, and so our solutions here that we propose and solutions that might be feasible on our end in a developed economy may not necessarily be transferable to non-OECD countries, and this is an important factor. I mean, because in developing economies, the issue is around collection, and in higher income countries, we have the regulations, we have the infrastructure to collect and manage those things so that they don't migrate to our world's oceans. And so I guess understanding that other economies are in a very different place is important, because in Southeast Asia, I mean, we have to focus on financing that collection, and because you can't recycle and you can't manage what's not collected, and that's a pretty significant issue. And so I know David, SWANA is well, let me first, I guess, make the point about there's some questions on here that I want to address, but I first want to make the point about we're talking about marine litter and climate change, and solid waste really is a climate issue, and 40% of the world's waste is disposed in open, uncontrolled, and unpermitted dump sites. And based on the volume of the waste generated, its composition, how it's managed, there's over 1.5 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions that are disposed primarily in these open dump sites, and these are the ones that are disposed in landfills that don't have the gas capture systems. And so that's 5% or so of our global emissions, and so these emissions are expected to increase by over 2.5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year by 2050 if we make no improvements to the sector. And so it's a public health issue. It has climate implications, and as you noted, it has dire consequences to the marine life and to our ecosystems. And so SWANA is addressing these issues in a number of ways, but I know that you also have an initiative that you're working on with the International Solid Waste Association, and that's the Close the Dump Sites campaign, which I think is a very notable focus, knowing that a large percentage of our waste is mismanaged in open dump sites and contributing to emissions and other factors. You want to talk more about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So SWANA is the U.S. representative to ISWA, which, as Rachel noted, is the International Solid Waste Association. That's basically the international version of SWANA with representatives in 100 countries throughout the globe. We are also the Canadian representative, so we have more votes in ISWA than anybody else. It's kind of a funny quirk of the system. But we hosted ISWA's World Congress in 2017 in Baltimore. And as a result of doing that, that exposed us and our members to the growing international issues associated with waste management, as opposed to just focusing on the United States or Canada. And you've hit on the head the two principal problems. It's closing dump sites, because dump sites are huge emitters of greenhouse gases, and methane is 25 times worse than two. And the fact that we have megacities where whether it's Jakarta or Calcutta or a whole bunch of others that are rapidly growing and generating ever higher quantities of waste. And so that was sort of brought to our attention as a result of hosting the World Congress. And so we've done really three things in response to that. The first one is that I serve on the federal government's Environmental Technology Transfer Advisory Committee. This is a committee that meets on a quarterly basis in Washington, D.C., that advises the U.S. government on how to provide environmental technologies and services to people, I'm using the word people incorrectly, to potential users primarily in developing countries. It's been I've served on this group for now 4 years. And it's been terrific to interact with peers in other countries as well as other industries to understand the scope of the problems that they have there in these other countries. The second thing that we've done is we've been very much promoting ISWA's Close the Dump Sites campaign. We think closing the dump sites is an important trigger for fixing or addressing the systemic problems associated with solid waste management in developing countries. If you close a dump site and replace it with a modern sanitary landfill, you greatly reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. You greatly reduce the amount of material that may go off of that landfill and end up in the river and heading into the ocean. I had the good fortune to go to Brazil and meet with my counterpart there, because Brazil is actually the location where they had the first of the 50 largest dump sites in the world closed. And they've replaced it with a modern landfill. It takes money. It takes technical expertise. There's a role for the international banks, such as the World Bank or others there, to help finance that. But we have to create a bridge to a better environmental future for the people in these developing countries, because the status quo simply is not sustainable. The third thing that I'll just briefly mention is that we have, since 2017, made sure to provide a lot of internationally facing content at our events, whether it's at conferences or webinars or resources on our website, swana.org. We're very mindful of the fact that it's a global solid waste system, that SWANA members have a lot of expertise related to different aspects of that system, and we want to be able to offer that expertise to people who need it.
And so we've been talking some about some of the international efforts and the Basel Convention, but waste management it's an essential public service, and it's needed to protect public health and safety in the environment. And so, outside of that federal statutory framework, RCRA, that we were talking about earlier on, which is responsible for the overall waste management, the local government essentially assumes the responsibility for overseeing and the provisions of waste management to its citizens. And so this is a little bit different now because there hasn't been a whole lot of federal activity in this, but there's been some recent legislation that's been introduced to Congress, and it's slated to provide the necessary federal funding for recycling infrastructure, for public education, some outreach, and I think they're doing some updating the federal procurement process to help strengthen the demand for recyclable materials. And so this is a good thing, right? Because it indicates a growing trend in the federal attention to waste management and recycling related to these issues. But the three pieces of legislation that are out there all have sort of a different focus. And so there's no doubt that the recycling sector needs improvement, but each of these pieces like have a focus. I mean, what is the right approach? Is it infrastructure? Is it education? Or is it a focus on supply chains?
So I would argue that it's really all of the above. It's a complicated system. And so we need more education to consumers so they know what is and isn't recyclable. So they can make a decision about that yogurt container or that peanut butter jar. So municipalities have not funded recycling education as well as they could have. And let's face it, during an economic recession and with tax money going down, there isn't a lot of spare money to go around for recycling education. So many of those pieces of legislation you're referring to contain money for recycling education. But in addition, we need to strengthen domestic infrastructure. We need to incentivize people or companies to site facilities that will receive material and update their existing MRFs, update their recycling systems. I have been very pleased by the fact that in the past 12 months, there have been more hearings on Capitol Hill about recycling than there have been in the 20 years previous where I've worked in Washington, D.C. It's remarkable that there's this much congressional attention to it. Unfortunately, as you may have heard, the Republicans and Democrats don't always get along on everything. But in this area, there is a growing consensus that our recycling system needs attention. I don't want to say broken, that might be an overstatement. But it needs more attention, whether it's financial attention or otherwise. And in fact, one of the bills, the Save Our Seas Act 2.0, which includes money for overseas marine litter activities, that actually passed the US Senate unanimously earlier this year. That is what I would describe as sort of the piece of legislation that's ahead of the others, which have not yet passed either House of Congress completely. The SOS Act is reasonably generous and importantly is sponsored by the senators from the Republican senator from Alaska and the Democratic senator from Rhode Island, who, facially don't have much in common politically or otherwise, but they both are from states that have very much a significant coastline compared to the state. And Alaska's coastline is actually, I believe, bigger than the coastline of the rest of the United States combined. And Senator Sullivan, to his credit, has been very much a leader in this area. I don't expect legislation to make it over the finish line in calendar year 2020. But I do think that SWANA and other organizations have done a good job of educating congressional leaders about the need for legislation. And I'm hopeful that in 2021, there will be an appetite to move some of these bills that have been percolating in Congress for the last 18 months.
Yeah, I agree. And I see it as hopeful too. I think leadership at the federal level is imperative to help support the nation's recycling system. And I think congressional action really sends a powerful message that our federal government prioritizes resource management and recycling. And so that's an awesome thing. And so, yeah, I hope it progresses as well. So we've got a lot of questions, and I want to move to a topic and address some of these questions. And we've talked a lot about the energy transition and renewables and waste management. That's a growing topic for many, and sustainability is kind of critical to all of this for an informed transition. And when we say sustainability and energy transition, it's more than companies and governments integrating renewables. We really have to assess the big picture and be mindful of the end of life considerations. And technologies that are going to get us there, that's going to help facilitate this transition, including lithium battery that power electric vehicles and wind turbines and solar panels and improved energy storage systems. They all require really significant amounts of mineral and metal outputs, and they generate a lot of waste throughout its life cycle, especially at the end of life. And so they have impacts across that entire value chain. And so I think latest figures from the International Renewable Energy Agency estimated that for solar panels alone, there are already over 250,000 metric tons of waste. And that's going to be projected to increase to 78 million metric tons by 2050. And solar panels, they contain hazardous waste, and they can't be removed without pulverizing that entire panel. And so at the end of the life, many of these are either exported and reused, which second life is great, but there's implications to that too, especially with our murky and opaque supply chains. And so they're oftentimes landfilled and incinerated. And so today the recycling costs more than the economic value of the materials recovered, which is why most of them end up in the landfill. And the same thing can be said about the wind turbine blades. And one of the biggest costs of wind energy actually comes at the end of its life cycle. And so when we look at the next 4 years, David, I mean, we're going to be removing over 8,000 wind turbines. And we're in the process of decommissioning the older turbines, most of which were built over 10 years ago, and taking into account shipping them to landfills and the logistical challenges of that, because they have to be broken up and then buried in these 30-foot deep pits. They're going to generate over 43 million tons by 2050, and so this is a major issue, right? Some states are looking to address this, like California. They've passed a law 5 years ago to help facilitate the collection and processing of solar panels, but they don't have clear regulations to help establish disposing and recycling of them. And so it's a big problem that I don't think we really think about. It's a glaring blind spot. I mean, what are your thoughts on renewable technologies in the end of life? Because do recycling systems currently in the U.S. and our management systems, do we have the capacity and technology to manage these things?
Well, the specific issues you were just describing around solar panels and wind turbines are what we characterize or describe as emerging recycling issues. This has become an issue that we are tracking over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, as reports began to develop about what are we going to do with this increasing volume of particularly solar panels. Wind turbines are made out of metal. Metal is recyclable. Either there's a market for it or there isn't a market for it. But SWANA has technical divisions, which are the subgroups within SWANA that deal with different components of the waste sector. So we might have a technical division around sustainable material management as opposed to landfill gas. So our sustainable material management technical division is tasked with developing SWANA policy on how these materials should be managed. We're not there yet, to be candid, but we're fully aware that we need to be providing more content to our audience and others about how to manage these systems, because at the end of the day, if we don't, that material will go to landfill. Now, the good news there, and something I want to make sure people participating understand, is that there's no landfill shortage in the United States. We're not in a landfill crisis. We've got adequate capacity to manage all of the waste material that we currently generate, with the slight exception of the Boston metropolitan area, where landfills are closing and material is beginning to move out of Massachusetts. There's a shortage there. But other than that, we have more than adequate capacity for that material. So if that material is economically not viable and it goes to a landfill, it's not going to mean that we have a shortage or a landfill crisis. The place where we have a landfill crisis is in developing countries, where they have dump sites that leak into the oceans.
Okay, and so when we talk about this, I mean, we really need waste management data, because that's critical to creating policy and strategic planning, and to provide some clear estimates on future end-of-life waste. And so a dearth of this data and some of the definitional disparities on waste and what's waste and what's not waste, and how do we define these, especially when you cross borders. I mean, just between states, and then when you take it international, it makes it even more difficult too. I mean, so all of these things help with the big picture. And so I think with accurate data, governments can realistically allocate appropriate budgets and land and assess relevant technologies. And so what is industry doing to close some of these data gaps of some of the waste streams of solid waste? And do we need to establish end-of-life management policies or standards specific to energy technologies or these emerging energy technologies to help better understand the profile and what's coming online as waste in the coming future?
So let me deal with the first part of that statement or question first. There is no doubt that we need better data on how much waste material is generated, how it's disposed of, and those sorts of things. And in fact, earlier today, I participated in the EPA's weekly call with certain stakeholders because EPA is in the process of developing national recycling goals and a national recycling strategy.
Mm-hmm.
We discussed how Congress is slowly beginning to take action. EPA, partially in response to pressure from Congress, will next month send to Congress a national recycling strategy. There is a data component and measurement component to that strategy. Then in November, EPA is going to announce the first broad national recycling goal for the United States. That's big news because other than food waste, we don't have national recycling goals. We have goals in California and New York and so on and so forth. Having a national goal, which will require better data to understand what that goal, how to achieve that goal, is going to help us significantly figure out how to recycle more. This is one example. In the state of Florida, local governments get recycling credit for sending material to waste to energy because they're generating electricity as a result of that activity. So you actually have jurisdictions in Florida that have allegedly a 90% recycling rate, when in fact that's not really what's going on. What's really going on is that they're sending 60% of their material to waste to energy. So getting some conformity around and better transparency around the data that exists in the waste management sector is absolutely critical. And I'm just, I'm pleased that SWANA is not just at the table, but also to direct traffic at the table with regard to what's going to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, David. I'm going to address some of the questions. We have a whole lot of questions, which is great. So one of the questions is, not all municipalities separate trash from recyclables, and we know that. Many times the bins end up being emptied into the same truck. How can municipalities be incentivized to do a better job?
So I think that although there are instances where local governments, whether it's municipalities or private haulers, I don't think it's just municipalities, are commingling the trash and the recyclables together, that's the exception, not the rule. When that happens, it's often because there's pressure on the system due to other reasons. So I mentioned COVID increased residential waste significantly. What I neglected to mention is that people in our industry also were tested positive for the virus. And so we've had cities where literally hundreds of sanitation workers have not been able to go to work. So you have this perfect storm where you have too much garbage and you don't have enough workers to pick it up, but you're supposed to pick up recyclables separately from garbage. And so there are going to be times, unfortunately, when the material gets commingled. Now, how do you incentivize people to do a better job? You hinted at this earlier. Local governments are under-resourced. They do not have enough resources to adequately collect recyclables and get them to market. People aren't willing to pay, or let me say that a different way. People don't really pay a fair market rate to get rid of their recycling. They think recycling is free, and in some places, actually, you don't get charged extra for recycling. So that creates the wrong incentive. If we charged more for garbage collection and credited against that the recycling, you would see people put more material in recycling than in the garbage, and you would see local governments then pick up more recyclables compared to trash. There's a number of different concepts. Pay as you throw is one of them, but there's a number of different ways to do that. But at the end of the day, we need to charge people for the amount of garbage they're collecting. The average rate for municipal solid waste collection in the United States is like $15 to $25 a month. You can't send a box across the country for $15 to $25. My industry sends a truck to your house twice a week, every single week in that month.
Yeah, and I think what makes it confusing for a lot of it goes back to consumer education, right? Is it's confusing. Recycling is it seems simple, but when you start peeling away the different layers, it's very complex. And so when you're, when you're at home, you may have, where you live, like you may have certain restrictions and things that are accepted in that local area, but maybe at work you have different policies, and at school, you have different policies, and things can be mixed together and things can't. And some areas are single stream where you can throw everything in, and others you can't. And so I think there's a real confusion from the bottom up about what is recycling, how do we do it, and where does it go? And I think some of the funding that the federal government is proposing, and more funding to outreach and education can really go a long way. But I think looking ahead, we have to find a way to make recycling more economical, and it's likely going to be a combination of fiscal instruments and government standards, voluntary measures, and regulation to really increase that demand. And regardless of this configuration, it's really going to require the underpinning of informed and balanced policies, and policies that keep pace with technologies. And we're introducing, for example, we're introducing alternatives to plastics into the market, but we don't really know if they can be recycled and managed appropriate at the end of the life. So we're actually compounding the waste issue, and that's a big problem. And so communication across the entire value chain, and making sure that there's communication, especially from those in the development, production, manufacturing, with the waste management sector, and that's a really important thing. So we are coming up on 4 minutes left, and I want to get to a couple other questions here. And one of the questions, David, is how do we promote waste reduction at the beginning of supply chains rather than as an afterthought of recycling and landfilling? How can we address these issues, like planned obsolescence and single-use consumer products in a world where we are a consumer society, and so that's really production and sales are really the main goal for a lot of folks. So how do we promote that waste reduction and source reduction?
So EPA's pyramid is reduce, reuse, recycle. We spent much of our time talking about recycling, but of course, if we reduce the amount of waste that we generate, things are better. And so it's very difficult to communicate to 330 million Americans about reducing the amount of waste they generate. As you said, we're a consumer society, whether it's fast fashion or gadgets that you replace every 2 years. That's going to be a big challenge. What we've seen, though, over the last few years now is a growing number of consumer brands are making commitments to pull more of that recovered material into their operations. They are making commitments to use more recovered plastic in their bottles. They're using Dell's making commitments around the computers, and dozens of others. We're working with the Consumer Brands Association because we think that having better communication at the high level about what's going on is integral to improving the system, as opposed to what was happening 5 years ago, when a MRF would find out that a product has changed because it would start showing up differently at the MRF. All of a sudden, what was a metal can of tuna fish was now a pouch, and that pouch isn't recyclable. The metal from the can was, and the pick it up and move it to the metal, but now that pouch isn't. And if I could just add one more thing, if people take away one thing about improving recycling today that I haven't mentioned, plastic bags are not recyclable in curbside. Not only that, they require the facility operators to shut down their facility every single day to pull those plastic bags off of the various components. So even though there's a chasing arrow sign on plastic bags, they are not recyclable in curbside. Stores take them back, supermarkets and whatnot. Please don't put them in curbside.
Yeah, excellent point. Just because it has the chasing arrow sign, that doesn't denote that it's recyclability. It really is just denotes its resin. So anyway, one final question for you. So for those people that are interested in waste management and learning more and what we can do, where would you point them? Like, what are some good resources for folks?
Well, first of all, I think what the Baker Institute is doing by shining a light on some of the sustainability challenges we face associated with waste management is important. So certainly stay connected to you and the good work you're doing. I would also suggest, swana.org has a lot of resources on it. We've had pages and pages of resources around recycling, as well as around instructions to people about how to manage material during COVID. I mentioned the EPA Facts and Figures webpage. There's a whole host of material there, not just the Facts and Figures document, but other resources for people who want to dig into the data that's there. SWANA is an individual membership organization. It's really a terrific way to network with other like-minded solid waste professionals. And so if some of you are interested in learning more about the organization, people should email me at dbiederman, Biderman, @swana.org. I'd be glad to help provide more information about our organization. We're the largest and arguably most prestigious solid waste association in the United States. And we want to be able to provide resources and information to everybody, members, non-members, and the like, because at the end of the day, we're doing this for our children and our grandchildren. And so we need to get this right, and we need to get it right now.
Yeah, and David, I can't thank you enough. We're at the end of our hour, and I really thank you, your expertise, and your time today. And I hope to bring you and some of your members back on future webinars. And this has been exciting. It's my favorite topic. And there's a lot of great questions that we didn't address that I promised to bring back to future webinars. We have another webinar next Tuesday, August 25th at 5 p.m. Central Time, and we're going to be exploring the connection between COVID-19, waste management, recycling, and sustainability. And so we'll be doing a bit of a deeper dive on that. David, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. It was nice chatting with you.
Thank you, Rachel, and everybody have a great and safe day.
Bye-bye.